Whenever I look over somebody's shoulder, always with permission, and watch what they're doing on the internet, invariably their behavior's a little different than mine. I'm more likely to open information in a new tab rather than the current tab. Someone close to me is constantly selecting things, but not to copy and paste, just to highlight, which I find odd. We all use our machines slightly differently, and we definitely use our browsers and search engines in slightly different ways, each of us. I consider myself an above-average internet user in terms of my technical merits and how much I use the internet. But more than 50% of people also think they're above average, so who knows? Well, my two guests today probably know. They had access to a large data set, we'll talk about how they got it, a combination of web tracking and later survey data. When they blend these two data sources, a number of insights are available about the different ways different demographic groups use search engines. We'll get into those details and more on today's interview.
So my name is Aleksandra Urman, or Sasha is also the kind of nickname I go by. And I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. I work with Social Computing Group, that's Department of Informatics, though my background generally is in social sciences. So I'm kind of working, my work generally is in between social science and computer science. And my primary research areas, I would say, currently is research on web search, on the HCI aspects of that. So this is algorithmic bias in web search, but also how users interact with it. And another stream of my research is political communication on social media platforms, broadly defined, so to say.
Yes, my name is Mykola Makhortykh. I am an Alfred Landacre lecturer at the University of Bern, specifically working at the Institute of Media and Communication Studies in Bern. One of my central projects that I am working right now deals with the impact of the algorithmic systems, such as web search engines or recommender systems, on the Holocaust remembrance. But like Sasha, I also definitely having a bunch of interests which deal broadly with information retrieval systems, as well as their potential bias, as well as the implications for the public sphere, especially information behavior in relation to the politics, but also historical information.
Well, how did your collaboration come together?
Well, I was actually doing PhD where Mykola works now at the Institute, but we didn't meet there. We met before. Mykola joined, I think, a year or so, right before when I was still doing my PhD, and Mykola was already a postdoc in Amsterdam at that time, if I recall correctly, and we met basically at a conference. And we talked about a paper that we could potentially collaborate on based on, I think, what we both were presenting, and then we just kind of started collaborating remotely via email. And then Mykola joined the institute because there was a position open that was pretty fitting, I would say.
The main paper I invited you guys on to discuss is the You Are How and Where You Search, Comparative Analysis of Web Search Behavior Using Web Tracking Data. So caught my attention right away, but neither of you work at Google, who has most of the web tracking data. How do you get started on a project like this?
So essentially, we both were at the time working, I was still in Bern, and we were working on that web tracking project more generally, where essentially it's a project joint between Germany and Switzerland, the goal of which was to collect browsing data overall, not focused on web search specifically, just browsing data from the users who agreed to participate in it. So they basically installed a plugin that would record all of their browsing except a dedicated block list, which was, a list of sensitive websites. Like we didn't record anything on their visits to banking or to insurances, to adult websites and things like that. So everything else was recorded unless they would press a button and say, don't record me for the next 15 minutes. And they could press it as much as they wanted to. So we had this data collected for a different project that just deals more generally with people's information consumption online and news consumption online. And since we both were interested in web search, as we do a lot of work on web search bias, so not focusing on the users, but focusing on the search engines themselves, this we saw as an opportunity to just use this data to look at the other side that we didn't explore before, at the user side, about how users actually search, because previous studies were mostly based on either eye tracking data So there's a small lab studies where people come, there is an eye tracker, and the researchers look at what people look at on web search pages, which is cool to see, in more detail what people do, but also the kind of ecological validity of these studies is a little bit lower, kind of not too high. And another stream of research was historically log-based studies. For example, when Google or studies that were done in the early 2000s, there were some other search engines, not Google, researchers from these companies, or they would give access to some academic researchers just based on all the transaction logs from one search engine, basically check what people click on, what do they do. And we had this trove of data that allowed us to look at scale, kind of in real life, at multiple search engines at the same time. So bringing together the benefits, so to say, of these two previous methodologies.
You'd mentioned being able to collect some of that data from the Chrome plugin. Could you expand a bit on how you got people involved in that study?
Pretty much, as Sasha noted, it was basically the paper is one of the outputs of a larger project, which was done by the two universities, the University of Bern and the team led by Silke Adam, and the University of Koblenz-Landau and the part of team led by Michaela Meyer. And the idea was to basically recruit a representative sample of German and Swiss citizens, and then also invite them to share their data using the plugin system. So pretty much we collaborated with a market research company, which has samples of online panels coming from the two countries, the Germany and the Switzerland. And pretty much we indeed asked them to recruit a sample of participants. And then each participant was basically asked to express either his consent or the lack of consent to be tracked. And naturally, quite a number of people didn't agree to participate, which was expected because it's first of all, quite novel way of researching information behavior. But second, it's also still, I would say, quite privacy sensitive and quite inclusive way of actually studying people's behavior. But in the end, we actually received quite a number of participants who agreed to participate both in the tracking component and then also in the survey component. And basically, this group of people was the end target groups that we actually worked with in the project and based on whose data we actually wrote this paper.
And what does that data set turn into at the end of the day? Do you have a list of URLs or something richer?
This data set is richer. So essentially, the plugin was developed within this research project, and it records also the snapshots of HTML pages, essentially, as a user sees them. It's not just the set of URLs, you also have all the HTMLs, even though they are naturally quite messy. If you work with a lot of data, it's quite difficult to extract stuff. But with web search specifically, it's easier in a way because, we have a limited number of web search engines, and it's easier to write dedicated scripts essentially to extract users' clicking behavior, for example, from this limited set of websites. Like, we don't need to analyze every website in the world for that. We can just write 6-7 scripts, one per search engine, and go with it.
Thanks to our annual sponsor, Weights and Biases, the developer-first ML platform. Weights and Biases is an enterprise-grade platform that gives you experiment tracking, dataset versioning, and model management. Their solution integrates with TensorFlow, sklearn, XGBoost, Hugging Face, and literally every other framework I could think of. Integrating with your model training process takes just a few lines of code, and there's even a nice live notebook on their site that'll show you how to get it going. Once your machine learning code base or notebook is wired up, you've just unlocked the next level of productivity. The Weights and Biases platform collects, aggregates, and beautifully displays all of your key metrics and telemetry so you can track your model training in real time and compare different runs. Have you ever had to screenshot a matplotlib graph that you drop in an email or in Slack to show your boss the results of your work? That's like serving a gourmet dinner in a cardboard box. With Weights and Biases, all of your collaborators can see the results of different runs with an idealized interactive suite of tools. You no longer have to be the single source of truth for your whole organization about how the model's doing. If you're on or leading a growing team of machine learning practitioners, you need to investigate if Weights and Biases is the right solution for you. Get started at w&b.me/dataskeptic and mention us when you request a demo. thanks to our sponsor BB Edit from Bare Bones Software. If you're a Mac user and you have any need whatsoever for a text editor, which, let's face it, that's got to be all of us, you have got to check out BB Edit. BB Edit 14 provides Mac users the most powerful, professional-grade text editor around. It's known as capable and rock solid, and can process files that are large enough to bring other editors to their knees. This tool's been beloved for over 25 years, and I can understand why. If I'm just typing up some simple hello world, I guess any text editor will do. But when I really get into the weeds and need to do some data processing, maybe I've got a big messy file, I need to find all the non-ASCII characters and remove them, BB Edit's there for me. It has best-of-breed multi-file search and replace and great scripting support for text transformations. There's a whole menu of text transformations that you'll find handy. If you're a serious data scientist or software engineer, you're going to bump into situations where you need a powerful text editor. So download and try BB Edit today. You can get it at www.barebones.com. See how much your productivity can increase. barebones.com and download BB Edit.
Well, you've got a very robust data set here that could probably launch a dozen different papers. Could you talk about the specific research questions that were at the forefront here?
So I would say that you're totally right, Kyle. There are definitely really a lot of different research papers that can be written using such a rich data set. Essentially, we had several core research questions, which were pretty much at the forefront of the whole project, which was initiated by Professors Adam and Professors Meyer. So their specific interest was, for instance, in the consumption of the information related to the right-wing populism, which I would say is definitely important both for Switzerland and for the Germany. We also certainly had some, I would say, spin-off papers, which were introduced at some point by the members of the research team, because we basically had 6 or 7 people. The number varied depending on the stage. And there was definitely some interest, for instance, from certain group members in studying how the news consumption can be actually investigated using this type of data, because it definitely provides some, again, quite innovative ways of actually understanding how people discover news, how they actually search for the news in their desktop browsers, and what kind of information do they reach in the end. Another topic that was, for instance, of quite some interest for me and also for Sasha is the idea of the algorithmic personalization. Because as Sasha noted, one of the big advantages of this specific approach is that you can actually capture not only URLs, but actually the content of the URLs. And it actually also means that you can potentially capture the personalized content delivery, be it, for instance, the output of the, let's say, individualized news feed on the social media, or, for instance, individualized outputs for the news aggregator. So it definitely was something that we can potentially study using this approach, and something that we might actually study in the future. And then there was definitely also quite some interest, for instance, also in changes in the consumption of the information at the time of the lockdown, because the data was collected in 2020, which pretty much was the peak, let's say, one of the first peaks of the COVID coming to the Europe. And then in this sense, it was definitely quite unique data set. So, for instance, we also had some team members who were actually writing some papers on how changes in the political trust actually correlate with the changes of the information behavior during the lockdown. So you're totally right. I would say that there's definitely so many interesting research questions which you can actually pursue using this type of data.
Yeah. And when it comes to this specific paper, basically what we wanted to do is do a spin-off, or, as Mykola said, of this general research project and just look at web search use. Again, because previous studies were either eye tracking, so small samples, but you can see what users look at and what they click on, or this transaction log data, which is large, but typically one search engine. And also a lot of the studies, specifically with the log data, come from early 2000s. And it's, of course, possible that nothing changed since then in users' behavior. But also, on the other hand, we know that search engines have changed drastically, like the interfaces. And general internet use has skyrocketed since early 2000s. So maybe users acquire higher, better internet skills, and maybe their clicking behavior changes, maybe not, so we wanted to investigate things like that. So we were generally interested in looking at this. And another advantage was that we had the survey data about these users. So we knew who they are in the sense that the data was, of course, anonymized, but we knew stuff about their demographics, some other questions, things like that. So we could also reliably, without inferring it from the search logs, like it was again done by some previous studies, just by matching to the survey data, look at, do older users search differently? Do men search differently than women, and things like that?
Well, I have only my anecdotal personal experience, but it's a very strong one because I'm constantly on the internet. I have a sense of how many searches I do a day and that sort of thing. But I don't really have a sense of what other people do. But you do now from the study. Could you share some of the high-level summary statistics about the ways in which people use search engines?
One caveat before we dive into the statistics, we looked only at desktop browsing. So we do not actually know what was happening on people's mobile phones, and there is reason to believe that people increasingly use their mobile devices. On the other hand, this was the data coming from the lockdowns. So we also have probably reason to believe that people were spending a bit more time, maybe not on the go, but at home. We don't know, of course, if they browsed on the desktops or mobile at home, but probably desktop's share was a bit higher than in usual circumstances, so to say. Yeah, but now coming back to the statistics, we found that on average, web search took 10% of users browsing, 10-12%, depending on the sample, the country, which is quite a lot, to be honest, compared to other types of websites. So social media typically take up less browsing than web search. At the same time, we found that the average number of searches was around 17, 20 per day. So that's not too high, but that's the average. But of course, we had it was not necessarily normally distributed. So we also had a lot, quite some power users, but also some users who executed only very few searches per day. But in the end, that amounted to 15, 20 searches. But again, that was 10-12% of users browsing overall.
And what are some of the interesting ways that breaks down demographically?
One thing was that actually there are not too many differences demographically. We didn't find any significance in terms of education, for example. We didn't find significance in terms of gender, in terms of how frequently people use web search. We found some difference in terms of age. So younger users, perhaps unsurprisingly, use search more often than older users. And they also do it differently, but I will speak about that maybe in a moment. But overall, it looks like pretty homogeneous. Another thing that we saw were the temporal patterns that we still haven't explained really. We don't know what's behind that, but we see a clear gender difference in terms of when, so which times of day and which days of the week women versus men use web search. This difference was more pronounced in Switzerland than in Germany, and we are still unsure. So in both countries, the number of searches went down during the weekend a little bit, but it was more pronounced for women than for men.
So women are searching less on the weekend or more compared to men?
If I recall correctly, then for the women, the activity basically drops in the afternoons, starting from Friday until Monday, Kyle. So basically, in the first 4 days of the week, the patterns between men and women is really quite similar, as Sasha noted. But things really change more in the weekend.
I can't really hypothesize as to why, but interesting notes.
One hypothesis that we of course cannot say for sure, but we tried digging into data and explaining this. So this drop specifically happens for a specific age group of women. So somewhere between 25 and 40. The best explanation we came up with, our hypothesis here, is that it has to do with childcare. So maybe this is the age group of women who are likely to have small kids, and maybe in the mornings and afternoons of the last days of the working week or on the weekend, they log off their computers, they don't search for anything on their desktops, and they do spend time with their kids. This is also more pronounced in Switzerland, and we dug up some statistics. And in Switzerland, for women, once they become mothers, it's more common than in Germany to work part time. So, not to work, for example, the full working week, but work 4 or 3 out of 5 days during the week. So, that could be the explanation. But again, we can't say for certain.
It's an intuitive hypothesis, yeah. What about the search engines themselves? I mean, I think of, Google as the big dominant player, but it's certainly not the only one out there. I've also been told DuckDuckGo is particularly popular in Germany, but can't really back that up with any data. You guys can. What do the stats tell you?
So, Google is dominant, of course, in both countries. So, what we see is that in both samples, in Germany and in Switzerland, over 95% of our users who used web search at all, which was like 98% of all users, I think. Over 95% of people used Google at least once. And among these people, Google accounted for over 90% of their browsing. So if they went for other search engines, it was for 10% or less of their total browsing. So Google customers are very loyal to Google in a way. Then when it comes to the other search engines, we also looked at Bing, Ecosia, and DuckDuckGo. I think Bing would be familiar to most people as well as DuckDuckGo. Ecosia, my hunch is that it's more popular in German-speaking areas.
Your paper was my first exposure to it, yeah.
Yeah, because I think it was, like, if I'm not mistaken, it was created in Germany. So essentially, this is a browser that even before this paper, I heard about it from my undergrad students in Switzerland who use it. Essentially, this browser, for every search you execute, they claim to donate some money to tree planting. So to ecological projects. That's why it's called this Ecosia. And they also at least claim not to track you, not to personalize stuff. So other things that, like the DuckDuckGo selling point, that they don't track you, but also there is this ecological dimension. And my students who were into climate activism, for example, told me that they try to use this because they think it's good for the environment in a way. Again, Bing, Ecosia, and DuckDuckGo were the biggest ones. Actually, surprisingly, not DuckDuckGo even, but Bing was the most popular in a way after Google. So in Germany, over 17% of users have used Bing at least once in our sample. And in Switzerland, over 10%. Ecosia and DuckDuckGo in both samples were around like 2-4% of users used them at all during our browsing period, so not that popular. What we see in terms of patterns here, though, is that it's generally more common for older users to have used at least one engine other than Google, and also men. So older people and men are more likely than younger people and women to have used something else than Google.
When you look at the data and do some analysis, sometimes an effect is so strong it just stands out. No other methods required. But in cases when there's a lot of variables like this and a lot of data, you usually got to apply some regression to really have a strong analysis of it, which you guys did. Could you expand on some of the steps taken and the thoughts behind it, and then maybe even dip into the results?
So what we did, like one regression that we ran was about the frequency of web search use. There we don't really see strong effects, significant effects on demographic variables beyond age. Younger users were significantly more likely to use web search more. And then the other thing that we ran was trying to predict whether people used search engines other than Google at all. For that, we ran zero-inflated regression models. Zero-inflated, essentially, these are models that we had to run because, as I said, for a lot of users, they never went away from Google. So we had a lot of zeros in the data set, and regular OLS wouldn't work well here on such data. So we ran some zero-inflated models to try to predict individually for Bing, DuckDuckGo, and Ecosia, so these three most popular after Google search engines, whether a user would use them or not. And there we found very diverging results actually in the two samples. So we don't see a clear pattern even between the two countries that have arguably similar-ish media systems generally, and have some similarities in terms of political systems or cultures, but especially media systems. So generally, if you look into communication science research between these two countries, you often find some patterns that are common for both Germany and Switzerland. Not always, but that's fairly common. That's not the case here. We found, for example, that in the case of Switzerland, the use of Bing is more common among older users, as I said before, but that's common in both cases. Also, we found that this is more common for people with lower income in Switzerland and higher income in Germany. So this result was going into two different directions. On the other hand, we found that education level in both countries, so lower educated users were more likely to use Bing. And the other thing that we looked at was DuckDuckGo and the DuckDuckGo usage. So among those who used it at least once, people with lower income were again more likely to use it, and also only in Germany, but not in Switzerland. We see that men were way more likely to use DuckDuckGo more extensively. And when it comes to Ecosia, in Switzerland, the patterns were lower educated users were more likely to use the search engine, whereas in Germany it was again in reverse. But with the Swiss case, so among Swiss users, lower educated but richer, so with higher income, users were more likely to use Ecosia. In Germany, higher educated but with lower income. So it's kind of all a bit of a mess, as you can see. And we cannot say that there is essentially a very clear pattern as to who is more likely to use which search engine in these results. We are currently doing some follow-up study that's based on survey data from the US. We're trying to wrap up the first paper based on that, so there is nothing published, but there we see some other predictors of search engine use that we kind of expected. For example, with regard to the ideology, that right-wing users are way more likely to distrust Google, for example, and prefer DuckDuckGo. So this is, again, not coming from this observational data, but from what the users told us through a survey in the US about their preferences. And my hunch is that also between 2020 and now, this ideological cleavage has become stronger overall everywhere. So the fact that we didn't see it in Germany and Switzerland might actually be that it just wasn't there 2 years ago and it's there now.
Are there any interesting insights you think the search engines should glean from this? You'd mentioned like that DuckDuckGo is being more visited, maybe in both countries or maybe in one, but more visited by men. Are they somehow uninviting to female searchers? Or, is there any insight to take away that one of the search engines could make an improvement towards?
Yeah, I can probably go for it with some insights that I really find interesting, which are probably not necessarily related to the gender or age distribution, Kyle, but more, I would say, along the lines of how search engines are actually used. Pretty much, I would say that the findings that I find really interesting based on this paper is how much attention users actually pay to the first page of the results. Sasha would probably actually have the exact numbers, but I think that for Google, pretty much the 97 search activities actually never go beyond the first page. And I think for Bing, it is actually 99. And you're also having really disproportionate attention to actually the very first search result in terms of actual engagement with the user. So I would say that for me, it is probably something that I would not say that search engines do not necessarily not aware about it. I suspect that they're quite aware about the importance of the first page of the search results. But still, I find it really interesting to show empirically. And I would also say that it also raises quite a lot of normative points, because then we actually know that if there is so much attention to the very first page, then it actually puts even more responsibility on the search companies to actually deliver high quality information on the first page. Because now we know that even, for instance, if the good or high quality information is actually hidden on somewhere on the second or the third page of the search results, then it's very likely that users would never actually find this. So it actually really, at least for me, emphasizes the importance of actually filtering information properly, specifically for the very first page, and also curating it especially thoroughly. So at least for me, it was, I would say, main takeaway that I would also think that would be important for the search companies to take into consideration. And I think that Sasha might actually have better ideas about the gender or age implications.
Yeah, so not necessarily based on this paper, but based on some other work we have been doing, which focused on search engines themselves when it comes to what's different between Google and DuckDuckGo, let's say, because from the browsing data, we cannot necessarily reliably check that, since most users didn't browse the same stuff. So we cannot really compare the results that they saw beyond probably searching for COVID numbers that everybody in that period was doing. Everything else is very different. But other empirical work that we do that focuses on web search results is when we collect the data from multiple search engines at the same time on the same queries on a specific topic that we're interested in. And then we check, depending on the topic, the composition of the results. So one paper we did that specifically taps into this issue of ideological divisions that I mentioned before, and maybe the gender divide as well, was on comparing the share of conspiracy theories in search results between the 6 search engines. So Google, DuckDuckGo, and also Yandex, for example, or Bing, Yahoo, where we found that Google, compared to all the other web search engines, curates, does a better job of keeping some conspiratorial results from the first page. So they're not in the top, which, as Mykola just said, is super important because 97% of searches end sort of with the end on the first page, and 50% end with the first result. DuckDuckGo search results contain way more links to conspiracy theories. So if you search for something like flat Earth, at least at the time when we executed that on Google, you would find either links that would maybe describe what the flat Earth theory is, or would debunk, would basically provide all the arguments saying why the Earth is actually not flat. On DuckDuckGo, the top links were to some Flat Earth Society or something like that. So to a bunch of organizations that actually post on their websites what they present as proofs that the Earth is flat and that NASA is lying and things like this. So it was the case not only with the Flat Earth thing, but with a bunch of other stuff. And then later on, something similar was replicated by the New York Times journalists who did a similar analysis, but I think on slightly different queries. So they looked at some political phenomena in the US. And so that might be the reason why we see the ideological division in survey data. This also might be connected to this demographic division, because we know that generally in Germany or Switzerland, men are more likely to vote for far-right parties. If there is this ideological cleavage between right and left, we are also probably more likely to see men as the users of DuckDuckGo rather than Google. And another demographic that I think is more heavily into DuckDuckGo is, computer scientists very often, or people concerned about their privacy. So among computer science undergrad students, when you first ask them, this group is typically male-dominated. I don't know, 30% of my students sometimes raise hands and say, yeah, okay, I have tried to switch to that from Google, or I try to use it, or I use it regularly. So that's another stream kind of users that's probably driving that gender divide.
What's next for both of you?
So in terms of research, I assume...
Or if you're going to start a rock band, that's cool too, but yeah.
Yeah, in the academia, I think you sometimes think of that, but I can't really play musical instruments, so not an option. So as I mentioned, we continue doing work on biases in web search and information distribution. And another part is this survey that we just conducted in late August in the US, generally about users' perceptions of web search, about trust in web search. And then we try to see what determines that, what determines their preferences on, let's say, content moderation in web search. So these are the papers that are to be finished or written.
Yeah, I would say we definitely have some interesting papers on upcoming, Kyle. So we definitely have some papers in work dealing, for instance, with the representation of genocides and denialism on the web search engines. So very soon we would have a paper out on how different search engines, such as Google or Yandex, for instance, provide information about the Great Ukrainian Famine, which is something which is basically a historical episode, which is quite contested, and that we were really very much interested in how search engines actually dealing with this historical contestation. Do they, for instance, take a Ukrainian side? Do they, for instance, take the Russian side? And then we certainly also having on the table some papers dealing with how search engines report on the conspiracies related to the war in Ukraine. You definitely can probably think about some, starting with the biolabs, ending with the Ukrainian secretly working on the nuclear weapons to actually attack Russia. So it's definitely something that we likely would have coming out in the upcoming months. So definitely stay tuned. There would be more interesting things from our side coming.
Absolutely. Looking forward to reading that as well. Keep me posted. We'll put something in the newsletter if nothing else.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Thank you for the invitation again.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. It was a pleasure.
Well, that's it for this episode of Data Skeptic Ad Tech. Join us again next time when you'll hear more about this.
The thing is that nowadays it's super easy to track mouse movements without the user even noticing that this is happening. It's not interfering with your browsing experience. It's happening in the background. You don't notice that, and then the browser will send your activity to the web server without you even noticing.
That's next time on Data Skeptic Ad Tech.